So, welcome. Thanks for joining us for this evening. This is the third of 4 live discussions as part of COPnes26, which is Totnes Town and the region's parallel event to COP in Glasgow. And these events have been planned to enable informed, transparent and open debate on aspects of the environmental crisis. We'd like to welcome and thank our panellists because they've agreed to participate in the spirit of open and informed discussion, and we're extremely grateful for their participation. So on the discussion panel tonight, panellists, would you mind raising your hand when I mention your name? We've got Phil Baker, Strategic Planner with South Hams, West Devon and Plymouth Councils. We've got joining us very shortly, Professor Tim Lenton, who I'll introduce. Ah, he's there. Fabulous. Professor Tim Lenton, who is waving his hand there. Director of the Global Systems Institute and chairing climate change and earth system science at the University of Exeter. We have Alastair Mumford, Southwest Energy Partnership Regional Programme Manager, Devon. And we've got Simon Oldridge, Sustainable South Hams. And we've got Dr. Bridget Woodman, Deputy Director of the Energy Policy Group in the Centre for Geography and Environmental Science at the University of Exeter's Penryn campus. So the way we like to do things in Totnes Talks is to give each panellist 2 minutes to outline who they are, what they do, and their position and angle of interest on the discussion topic. So Tim, who's just joined us, Professor Tim, I'm just going to give you a bit of time so that you can settle, okay? And I'd like to start, please, with Phil. If you could introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and give us your position and angle of interest on this topic.
Thank you, Jim. Good evening, everyone. My name is Phil Baker. I'm a Strategic Planning Officer with South Hams, West Devon and Plymouth Councils. So I write planning policy and strategies into local planning documents, and they shape and manage change over a 20-year timeframe. So I'm the policy lead on climate change and carbon reduction for the councils with regard to planning policy. Planning isn't often seen as the most dynamic or responsive area in terms of how we kind of react to external stimulus, but we are trying to kind of drag the planning system kicking and screaming into the kind of modern day and be a bit more proactive and forward-looking in our approach. Personally, I was born in Totnes, for those of you that can remember when Totnes had a maternity hospital. I grew up in Kingsbridge and I live with my young family in the South Hams. And I'm participating tonight as much to be part of that wider discussion, really, and to share thoughts and ideas with the panelists and the audience.
Thank you, Phil. Alastair, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, so Alastair Mumford. So I work for Devon County Council. We've also got a partnership with the Bristol City Council and Plymouth City Council, which is called the Southwest Energy Partnership. So lots of acronyms, I'm sure that'll be the start of many more today. So my work is around developing and delivering low carbon projects. At the moment, that seems to really be mainly around building retrofit. So that's the refurbishment of buildings to decrease their energy consumption or decrease their carbon emissions. And then also around electric vehicle charge point infrastructure. So sticking in of charge points across the country and trying to facilitate that as well. Do some other bits of stuff around energy contracting and things like that, but and trying to look at local supply, but we could talk about that maybe if it comes up. And also, just out of disclosure, I'm a volunteer director for Exeter Community Energy, and obviously Totnes has got their very fantastic Tressoc Community Energy Organisation as well. And yeah, like Phil, really just keen to be part of the discussion really and help in any way I can with this important subject.
Thank you, Alastair. Thank you. Bridget, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hello. My name's Bridget Woodman. I'm based at the University of Exeter's Penryn campus in Cornwall. And my work is mainly focused on policy and regulation in relation to energy systems, and how the design and implementation of policies and regulations can help us get from the unsustainable energy systems that we've got in place at the moment to something that's much more sustainable as well as being low carbon. So a lot of my work at the moment's focused on decarbonising heat, simply because it's been an incredibly neglected area when policymakers think about decarbonising, the focus has predominantly been on electricity, and as electricity systems are decarbonising, obviously heat becomes a much greater proportion of our overall emissions. So that's where I'm sort of working mainly at the moment.
Thank you, Bridget. Okay, and Tim, first of all, apologies that you didn't have the link, and then apologies again for being video muted when you arrived. That was our security protocols, at least they were working. So welcome and thank you so much, because I know you've had a very busy week. I believe you've been up in Glasgow, or you've been involved in all of that. So if you could introduce yourself to everybody and give us your particular angle on this subject. Thank you.
Sure, Jim. Yes, hi everyone. I'm Tim Lenton, recently staggered back from Glasgow on the train. Yeah, I'm at the University of Exeter's Streatham campus in the city of Exeter. I direct something called our Global Systems Institute. My own work is on identifying climate tipping points, the bad tipping points in the climate system. But I've also shifted my focus in the last couple of years to identifying the positive tipping points we can find and trigger to accelerate the just transformation that we need.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. And Simon, could you introduce yourself, please, with your angle?
Yeah, good evening and thanks for having me back. I work with 0 Hour, the campaign for the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, as well as Sustainable South Hams, a community outreach group. Humanity has developed an economic system that places no value on nature. It's delivered some huge benefits, but without the acknowledgement that we're actually part of nature, the system's now dangerously out of control. And if we don't make a radical course correction, the destruction that we're inflicting on the ecosystems that we depend on for life risks becoming irreversible. England was recently ranked the 7th worst in the world at protecting nature, according to the RSPB, in large part because we used our trees to fuel our empire and the Industrial Revolution. UK woodland cover is just 13% compared to a 38% EU average. The government says it will plant 30,000 hectares a year of new woodland, and I've had this replied in many letters from correspondence with my MP. It does sound impressive on the face of it, but that's only 1/10 of 1% of our land area, so it would take 10 years just to scrape up to 14%. The Environment Bill, which I believe we're talking about tonight, has been touted as a solution to our problems, but that's not really true. Its main purpose was to fill gaps in our legislation now we've left the EU. Its ambitions are low. It only aims to halt the decline in nature, not really good enough when you're 7th worst. It's got nothing on climate, despite some claims to the contrary. It doesn't mention carbon or CO2 or fossil fuels or aviation. And it has a UK-only focus, totally ignoring our impact across our global supply chains. The CEE bill, in contrast, would make it a legal requirement, not just to halt the decline, but to reverse it and actually restore nature. And it would ensure that we tackle the climate and nature crises, which are inextricably linked together, so that the solutions to one don't cause problems in the other. Last little bit, 30 parish and town councils across South Hams have called on our 2 MPs to support this bill. So far, they're sticking to the government line, but I've met Anthony Mangnall, and I do think he wants to do the right thing. He's bound by the whips, I suspect, at the moment. So I do hope he looks past this current administration and steps onto the right side of history. Thank you.
Okay, wow. Okay, thank you, Simon. I just want to backtrack a little bit because, 1 minute we're talking about the climate crisis, but then you mentioned several times nature, the value of nature. So are we in as much a crisis of biodiversity as climate? Or does one outweigh the other?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've known a fair amount about climate for a long time, and I've been learning about nature, and the more I learn, the more worried I get. And I think it's fair to say that this is very much a dual interlinked crisis. Damaging nature can make climate change worse, but restoring it can also lessen its impact. So we have to choose which path we're going on. To explain this point in a little more detail, it's probably helpful if I bring up a little bring up a little graph here and explain the concept of carbon budgets. We've been told by the UN's International Panel on Climate Change that we mustn't emit more than another 400 billion tons of carbon if we want a reasonable chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. But that means, you can see from that chart, that means we've got to cut emissions really quickly now to stretch out our carbon budget to 2050. I mean, to be honest, 2050 is way too long, but you get the idea. Now, the world's more on this sort of trajectory. People are talking about 2050 and net zero, but that means nothing in isolation. You can see that on this one over here, if I can get my hand in the right place, we burn far more carbon, even though we still come in at the same point, 2050. Now, the UK is not as bad. That's probably the global picture there. The UK is probably flatlining after some, a fairly good start with easy wins like getting rid of coal-fired power stations. But we're kicking the can down the road with the tricky tasks like Bridget mentioned, home decarbonisation and surface transport, and we're barely touching them. And instead, what the government's doing is it's planning to suck millions of tons of carbon dioxide out of the air, all in the future, from sort of 2030 onwards. And one of the ways that they're planning to do this is to build carbon capture plants at Drax Power Station, which burns wood pellets, to lock carbon underground. But and the plans assume about 2.5 Draxes by 2050. But Drax already uses over 50% of the whole world's wood pellet supply, wreaking havoc in forests in North America and Eastern Europe. And we're talking about scaling that up to over 100% of the current supply. With a technology that's not proven at scale. There are scientific bodies like the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, which say it won't even be carbon negative. It's more likely to be a net emitter, because we're forgetting the impact of chopping the forests down and all the carbon that those forests would have absorbed if they've remained. And then the cost, 32 billion in taxpayer support is estimated for Drax. And we're talking about scaling that up to what, 70, 80. And then and I won't go on, it'll become too long, but when you add in all the other negative emissions technologies, we're looking at government support of hundreds of billions, yet they can only scrape together a paltry £500 million for the current heat pump grant. So there's something really wrong with our priorities. The government's just failing to grasp the nettle. There's really the opportunity to cut our emissions rapidly now, but it means spending money, and it's no use just promising to spend money in the future.
Okay, thank you, Simon. I'm riven with jealousy over your amazing graphs, I have to say. I would love to be able to do that. But that has left me feeling very, very bleak. And I know that, Tim, you were talking about tipping points. Listening to that, it sort of feels to me like we're already at the tipping point. You've just come back from Glasgow. What are your feelings coming back from Glasgow?
Well, we know we're already pretty close to, if not past, a couple of climate tipping points, but there's still a lot we could avoid if we got our act together. Well, I mean, I didn't go to Glasgow expecting the political UN part of Glasgow to be a resounding success, let's put it that way. But I come back cheered up because of all the great things that are going on from all the other actors and non-politicians who are just doing fantastic stuff, forming new coalitions, coming together, whether it's in the green zone outside the main blue zone of the conference or in their own venues, which I was lucky enough to speak in several of the satellite Fringe Festival venues. So in my view, many of us, we just sit back and blame our government for not pulling finger and getting on top of stuff. And we should do that, and we should take them to task for their shoddy efforts, as we've just been nicely discussing. But there's another way to look at this problem, which is we can be the agents of the change as well. I mean, we have obvious examples with the movement, with Greta, XR, etc. But I'm talking about agency to actually tip the important change, the change that changes those lines that Simon was showing us. So we are talking here in concrete terms about, if we got some power to accelerate the decarbonisation of the global economy, to accelerate the electrification of transport, the shift to renewable power, revising our food and land systems fundamentally, probably changing our diets as well. Yeah, we've got a huge amount of power to have something to do with that. And outside the main event at COP, you've got people like the bits of the finance sector who manage a stellar amount of capital, who got more than enough if they shift their investments to make things happen. So it's always feels like a bit of a mixed blessing when you kind of see the rather hopeless lack of progress from the government representatives. But I have to say, I always thought it was an impossible task if you set up a process where you expect every country in the world to sort of agree on something. And now we're on the other end of the scale with unilaterally non-binding agreements from nations, so-called nationally determined contributions. Well, that's pretty much equally hopeless because there's no legal teeth to enforce governments to do what they say they're going to do. But the people I know in the COP26 team, in the government cabinet office, etc., they're smart enough to see that there's a whole lot in the spectrum between those two hopeless opposites. There's a whole lot of ways to make change happen, and it's all about coalitions of whether it's countries that have a shared vested interest in making the transformation happen sooner, or whether it's, you know, us as civil society with representative non-governmental organizations, with the finance sector, with the media telling a news story, with other key elements. That's where the excitement lies, and that's where the positive tipping points can happen. It helps if the government set the right, you know, context and support for that. We would all agree on that, but I think we're going to have to force their hand in effect.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Thank you for that. Alastair, I'd like to turn to you really in terms of, you know, what is happening, what is the strategy locally around around this huge issue? What's being put in place locally? And I'm particularly interested in transport.
Okay. Well, if I start at the widest scale then, so Devon County Council decided to, instead of paying some consultancy to come up with a grand plan for the county, which would have been quick, they decided to go down the Citizens Assembly route, which is longer, but you get much better engagement and buy-in, I think, from going down that route. So we're getting to an important part of that process. So the Citizens Assembly has met and they've gone through all the different, well, it was split into 4 themes, I think, one of which being transport. And obviously they heard from witnesses on each of those bits, and that's all happened. Then the plan comes together. There was a draft interim plan, but now there's the final plan, which is going to be published in spring, I think. And that will have a series of actions in there. Some of those actions, you know, I've been given some comments on the draft versions. Some of those actions are to lobby government on certain points, which, you know, aren't, well, they're an action. They're not fantastic, but, you know, they are something that we've all got to do because unfortunately we don't have much power as citizens of a small county, well, large county. But so yeah, so there's some lobbying in there, but there is some other stuff. And for Phil, there's some great stuff to help, well, to hopefully help with planning policy as well, to try and get that tightened up, particularly around the built environment. On transport, so there is, you know, the ambition is to be net zero in transport. There's some stuff in there around obviously improving EV transport there, but a lot around developing more local cycling, walking, you know, that transition. They have the transport hierarchy, don't they, in there? And essentially, we obviously don't want to move every single car to an electric car, because that's missing the point, really. And we need to reduce car ownership and other types of vehicle ownership and use. So there's lots of different sort of actions in there, but we're waiting to see what the final plan will be. And I don't think, you know, most of those things in there are going to be very obvious. And unfortunately, they probably do all rely on some funding. But as Tim mentioned, we are seeing the private sector getting interested in this. You know, if I talk specifically around charge points, always speaking to charge point operators that say, yeah, we've got the biggest funding behind us. Woohoo, you should see it. And that's great. I suppose what I challenge them with is, well, it'd be nice to get some community involvement in there. And generally I get the same reaction from them. There's a lot of sucking of teeth, and maybe we won't do that. So I think we need to look at that finance. And also there was some articles saying that although there seems to be a lot of people putting their hands up in terms of investing in green stuff, when you start really looking into it, they're looking for the same levels of return and the same levels of risk, which you're not really going to get in this area. But there's definitely interest out there. And I think we need to mix that with the community interest, enthusiasm, and money, so that we can get some really good projects off the ground.
Thank you, Alastair. Well, whilst you were talking, there's also lots of activity on the chat. There's certainly people saying, lovely, fabulous to hear good feedback on citizens' assemblies. The climate issue is so big, we have to take communities with us. So that was really valuable. And then also lots more questions around EV and charging, which you were talking about. I'd just like to share a tweet from Gary Streeter MP. I'm just going to share my screen here just to discuss about, have we actually got enough ambition? So the tweet here is as part of my ongoing work to pursue practical solutions to climate change across southwest Devon, my team has recently mapped out the publicly available electric vehicle charging points within the constituency. I was disappointed to find there are only a dozen, the majority of which along the A38 corridor. Whilst owning an electric vehicle is still far from commonplace for a wide range of reasons, I know that for many people, ease of charging them will be the deciding factor for if and when they get one. I want to see the number of public EV charging points at least double across the constituency before the next election. So that would take us to a total of 24 charging points. You know, are we being ambitious enough? And if not, what can we do about it? Alastair, could you pick up on that?
Yeah, so I think we are being pretty ambitious, I have to say. I think, yes, at the moment, if you go out the door, you're going to walk a long distance before you get to a charge point. But I think that's going to change quite quickly. So we've got, we secured some funding. And so we've got 2 phases of a project at the moment, which should be about 80 charge points going in public car parks across the county. Oh, well, by December next year, 40 of those would be hopefully by March. We've also got a project which is testing on-street charging, which is really difficult and is going to be pretty controversial, I think. And that's another 50, well, up to 50. It's probably going to be more like 30 sites across the county. And then, you know, a lot of the other districts doing it. Plymouth are doing a fantastic amount of work. Those are going to be going in as well. So I would have thought within the next 2 years, there will be quite a substantial change in the charging landscape. I would have to say, though, I say, going back to my earlier point, although, you know, we've really wanted to get charge points in, so we've sort of pushed with this project to do it. And so the first phase has been won by Scottish Power. And I'm immediately thinking, oh, God, am I actually doing this the right way? Should we be doing this a slightly different model? Should we be having more, you know, as I was talking about, community ownership? So there is that sort of thing about rushing in and then thinking, oh, are we going to have any regrets here? So we are trying to find some sort of balance on that. But I would say in terms of charge point infrastructure, I think over the next 2 years, there'll be some definite change. I think, Richard, I was just trying to type an answer to Richard. Richard particularly mentioned around rapid charge points. So these are ones where you can, you know, charge up a vehicle in say 30 minutes or less. I think for those are going to be much more commercial operations. Well, yeah, maybe not, or commercial operation, I would say. But there is some funding coming out from the government next year to supposedly help with that, and we would be keen to be bidding into that. It's mainly going to be grid is going to be the issue there, because you do need a lot of capacity. But yeah, so I hope that answers your question, Jim.
Thank you. Bridget, was that a wave?
Yes, just quickly.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that was a very casual wave. You need to do it a bit more.
I didn't mean to wave, actually. I was just like finding my balance, but I'm glad you noticed. Thank you. This is a really interesting topic, and it's something that yeah, the sort of provision of charging infrastructure for electric vehicles is going to become increasingly important. And I think, yeah, it's great that Devon's sort of being so proactive on it, but I think, yeah, just just sort of relying on cash-strapped, very stretched local authorities to deliver the infrastructure isn't really fair, actually. And there are all sorts of initiatives going on globally and things, but places like Germany have got schemes where they've divided up the country to make sure that there's a mix between high concentration urban charging areas, but also that chargers are provided in very rural areas, and so these zones are a mix of urban and rural, which means that you can sort of spread the costs a little bit, because otherwise you're not going to end up with chargers in very rural locations simply because they won't be economic. And so what they've got in Germany is quite a regulated system where the government's effectively paying for this charging infrastructure to happen. But then the actual charging points are operated by community groups or councils or whoever bids to operate them, and they have a regulated price. So what you've got is a much more strategic, less piecemeal approach, which is a bit more inclusive as well. It's involving local communities if they want to get involved, but it's also ensuring that you're ending up with charging points in places where they're not necessarily the most economically viable, but they're still useful to people who need to charge their cars in rural locations.
Thank you, Bridget. So Phil, what are the plans then for mitigating carbon emissions whilst developing connectivity across the region in terms of something like public transport, for example, or maybe looking at broadband, so sort of trying to remove the reasons for necessarily having to do so much travel? Is there a bigger picture here?
That's a good question, Jim. And I initially go back to something that Alastair pointed out, which was that there doesn't seem to be a lot of narrative at the moment around behaviour change or modal shift. The UK decarbonisation strategy for transport seems to be based on people swapping like for like petrol and diesel cars for electric vehicles, and it's not grounded in behaviour change. It doesn't really see or foresee a role for community-based transport, public transport. There's an awful lot of innovation that could be achieved through community transport, especially in rural areas, if given the favourable circumstances. And in just anticipating the mass rollout of private cars as EVs rather than petrol or diesel vehicles, we're not going to see that shift, particularly in the more marginal areas where we live, where rurally there is such a heavy reliance at the moment on the use of the private car. So from a planning point of view, we can obviously direct new developments to locations that benefit from better connectivity. Obviously, this is all relative because rural areas are very different from urban areas in terms of the services that are available. And it's the same for active travel as well in terms of walking and cycling. They are more challenging in rural areas. We can do what we can in terms of directing stuff. As I mentioned in the introduction, the planning system is always a little bit slow to react to short-term stimulus. And for years we've been trying to deliver a more sustainable pattern of development, but that's very much against the grain with regards to national planning policy. There's also a difficult balance to strike as well in terms of not just cutting off your existing rural communities, but coming up with a sort of robust and deliverable vision for all elements of the countryside, and trying to ensure that people benefit from a range of transport options and connectivity options, no matter where they live. And obviously broadband's a big part of that. We've just appointed a specific specialist in South Hams and West Devon to try and bring in more funding and faster rollout in terms of rural broadband connectivity, because we recognise obviously in the last 18 months people have been incredibly reliant upon broadband, and it does do quite a bit for journey reduction in terms of people going to work and the like. And obviously it's played quite an important part in terms of social interactions as well. So I wouldn't want to rely on it, of course. There's no substitute for face-to-face. I think we've all recognised that over the last 12, 18 months as well. But I think, yes, it's a multi-pronged approach in terms of how we deal with connectivity, both physical and digital. And that's something that we try to build into our planning policies and spatial strategies. But crikey, it's difficult trying to juggle all the different elements.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Phil, for that. You mentioned behaviour change there, and that chimed particularly with something going on in the chat earlier, where Tim was responding to a comment about the Environment Bill. And Tim, you wrote, the Environment Bill is really DEFRA's response to Brexit in leaving the cap and having to come up with a different subsidy regime for farmers, etc. It lacks system thinking. DEFRA just focus on what they have some jurisdiction over, but they're missing the big picture that diet change, alternative proteins, etc., may spell the end of meat and dairy farming. So Tim, I'd just like to ask you, do you think that there is a lack of honesty in the discussions around, behaviour change, that actually we need to make some serious behaviour changes?
Oh, interesting, Jim. Lack of honesty on whose part? The government's, or
okay,
or our own part?
Well, then maybe I would say a lack of clarity on the necessity for behaviour change.
Yeah. I think, well, really vexed issue, isn't it, folks? I mean, we've had a lot of, it kind of goes with the territory of neoliberal capitalism, that we get a lot of chat about individual behavior and choice. Where it's really at is around collective behavior, and how the latest research kind of shows how, well, I'm not a psychologist, but essentially they're talking about how being part of groups that are changing empowers all the members of the group. So I think, we all need to level with ourselves that for sure some changes in behavior could be a big driver of what I'm calling positive tipping points. But to make the change, we get more efficacy, as the psychologists call it. We get more sort of collective efficacy. We feel more empowered when we form little groups and we change together. And I suppose that's obvious to all of us on this call. I highlighted the sort of things going on in food systems because I honestly think we've still got a government and a civil service that, unfortunately, for the most part there in Westminster, are still thinking kind of linearly about how things are going to change. But we're seeing rampant amounts of evidence that we're having really non-linear or accelerating change with electrification of transport we've just been talking about, with power generation in the UK, which we've touched on. We've gone from 40% of electricity from coal power in 2012 to less than 2% now. That's pretty quick. I think that the space of diet and food systems could be one of the next to go. There's all these signals of many of us showing huge uptick in interest in alternative diets, but at the same time, the technology development that's developing alternative proteins, whether it's plant-based meat substitutes or it's kind of cultured meat or it's, bacteria that taste just like eggs in an omelette, this stuff is coming to market or coming down in price way faster than some people are presuming. I think we're in a fascinating time where, there'll be this, I think this Environment Bill is got this 25-year time horizon badge on it, hasn't it? And DEFRA's got this whole kind of 25-year plan. I think their vision of the next 25 years is going to be woefully out of date very quickly, but to the good of all of us, for the possibility for transformative change, really.
Okay, thank you for that, Tim. I mean, I've just seen in the chat, obviously we'd need to verify that by looking at ourselves, but breaking news, just heard that the Environment Act has been passed into law. Okay, so Bridget, moving to you, please. How do we reduce energy consumption in heat, but keep our standard of living against rising costs? I mean, this is a real sort of issue, isn't it, that we're fighting, we all want to do the same thing. We all want to achieve those net zero goals very, very quickly, but we've got a rising cost of living, and we're and the costs of modernising are going to be presumably substantial. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the quick and simple answer is more energy efficiency, actually, rather than necessarily providing, as a prerequisite for doing anything that provides you with decarbonised heat. And actually, the most basic sort of non-disruptive energy efficiency measures are actually really effective. So draft proofing, loft insulation, double glazing, all of those things that actually a lot of people already have will have and sort of enhancing those, you can do that without having to spend too much money, and you will make an appreciable difference both on your your comfort levels and your electricity bills or your energy bills. I mean, and that's a sort of short-term, quick lump of action that a lot of people can take, and a lot of there's obviously people who aren't in a position to be able to afford that for one reason or another, and they are very often the same people who end up being in fuel poverty. And that, so there is a role there for direct government intervention. And whether that comes through local authorities and people who actually know on the ground what the condition of houses is and things, or whether that comes through a slightly less harebrained scheme than the government's had in place in the past. There is a role though for that sort of direct regulatory approach. You can't just leave it to everybody to insulate their homes properly. But you've got that sort of short-term approach of improved energy efficiency. But then in the longer term, you do have to think about how you decarbonize the heat, decarbonize heat, and that can be through heat pumps. It can also be through sort of direct electricity radiators, sort of storage radiators. It can be through things like solar thermal, if you're not the most effective way, but it can provide you with heat. So that there's been interesting developments. The government has finally sort of put out its heat and building strategy. It put it out a couple of weeks ago, and actually, to my surprise, it was actually quite good. It's been an incredibly delayed white paper, but is actually. I couldn't work out why the delay was happening actually, because if you look at the analysis and things in the document, it's actually pretty much spot on. The difficulty with that and the heat and building strategy is that they're focusing very much on new build, and they're not really thinking about how you retrofit. And how people in the houses that we're all already living in can actually improve their efficiency and their sort of carbon performance. So there's still gaps in what the UK and how the UK is going to sort of try and achieve that balance between comfort and low carbonness. That we do have to begin to, we have to think about and focus on really quickly if we're going to meet all the carbon target, the carbon budget targets, because actually buildings, heat and buildings play an enormous role in what our overall emissions are.
Thank you for that, Bridget. That's really interesting. So right at the very beginning of last week, we had a similar discussion and new build planning came up. And I'd just like to throw to you, Phil, really about this, with the news that the Environment Bill has been passed. Does with the Environment Bill, does there come more legislative teeth in terms of ensuring that new builds are being built to the required specifications? Because from our discussion last week, the concern was around that actually even new builds immediately needed retrofitting.
I suppose the short answer is no. The approach to how we deliver new development is so fragmented that it's, well, for all that the Environment Bill might represent progress in some areas, we're still very much dependent upon building regulations for the kind of set the standards for new builds to be assessed against. And especially through the planning system, there's still a large amount of sway given to developer viability considerations, so guaranteed profit and return for national volume house builders over and above everything else. I think progress would be viability assumptions being, or viability calculations being done once or over and above a building being built to a certain standard, and perhaps generating sufficient on-site renewable energy to meet its own individual demands or something like that. But everything's up for grabs with regard to viability, including the thermal efficiency of a building and the energy that it generates on site as well. So unfortunately, I guess the short answer is no. I'm sure the government would say that things are kind of moving in the right direction, and that there are plans to roll out various strategies to improve the standard of new buildings, restrictions on new connections to the gas grid, etc., etc. But these things are, relatively speaking, so far in the future that they're going to be rendered already behind the curve by the time they're introduced.
So thank you, Phil. So Alastair, how do we ensure that corporations and organisations genuinely shoulder the legislation and policy needed for rapid and effective change?
Oh, Jim, that's another good question. Well, I would say bring about a bloody carbon tax. There we go. Bosh, done. But I don't think that's going to happen at the moment. So I don't know. I think as Tim was sort of saying, we can't rely on government. So let's just hope that the companies do start to see the light on this, or see the market potential. When you look at, I can't remember how much it was, but it was Microsoft bought, millions of pounds worth of, well, they made £1 million worth of investment in farms in Australia, I think it was, for around regenerative farming practices. So practices which should lock more carbon in the soil. Google are spending ridiculous amounts of money on stuff. So yeah, maybe that's going to be the way to do it, really. But yeah, I'd like to see more legislation and proper taxation, but is it going to happen, Jim? Unfortunately, I think I'd be a bit of a pessimist on that one.
Okay, thank you, Alastair. So Simon, I'd like to come back to you now, really, because we've talked a lot about the Environment Bill, and you've talked a lot about nature and importance of biodiversity. What are those key differences and similarities between the Environment Bill and the CEE Bill?
Well, if it's not too impertinent, I might just sidestep that question, because I've got a lot of comments on what everyone else has said.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think that there's an uncomfortable truth that if we really want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and just to reply to Peter Brown in the audience, above 1.5 degrees, the government has said we risk losing control of our climate for good in their latest strategy. That's not Greenpeace or something, that's the government. With tipping points potentially kicking in, we don't know exactly where. Tim Lenton probably knows better than almost anyone in the world. And then, we could really lose control for good, and we're talking about extreme sea level rise. Ultimately, Greenland alone has enough ice on it to raise the global sea level by 7 meters. Wildfires, crop failure. The UN's predicting up to 1.2 billion people on the move, fleeing famine. That dwarfs anything we've seen, and this is why people are talking about collapse of civilization. Now, if we carry on our merry path, putting everything off till tomorrow, we're going to see collapse. That's the fact. Those are the facts. When you listen to climate scientists talk about the pace that we actually really genuinely would have to decarbonize in the UK to not go above, to not take more than our fair share of that 400 billion ton carbon budget, we're talking about mid to late 2030s. Even the Climate Change Committee in their report that our plans are based on say transport must be over 80% decarbonised by 2030. And we're just not on anything like that path. We're going to be selling fossil fuel vehicles till 2030, and after that we're allowing hybrids. We're just fooling ourselves. But I'm probably more of an optimist than Tim. In terms of it having to all fall to us. I mean, if it falls to us, it's not going to work, because we're lacking leadership and we're lacking money. We've got Phil and Alastair. It sounds like they're trying to do really good stuff, but with nothing like the budget. And I hope actually they're looking at what we genuinely have to do to keep to 1.5 and then asking for whatever that amount is, because it's going to be really big, because the government needs to know. But that's why I'm really encouraged by the CEE bill. And at the moment, there are up to 150 MPs behind it. There are lots of Conservative councils behind it. There's a Conservative in the Lords, I think, now behind it. One Conservative MP has even backed its aims, although not quite come out to support the bill. There's mounting pressure. And I do think we can, it's possible, it's probably our best hope that we focus on asking our MPs to back it. It doesn't specify detailed policies. What it does is it locks policy to the outcomes we want to achieve, which is to limit warming and to restore nature. It just sets that into law. And then what would be triggered would be a strategy formulation process where a citizens' assembly would be consulted. They'd hear all the evidence. It would be televised. The public would be able to watch it, and they'd see people like them who are very skeptical, putting the sort of arguments they might put and the objections to giving up their meat and that sort of thing. But by going through that process, it would bring the public along, and the public has the realities of climate change and the biodiversity crisis have been hidden from the public by a press that does not want it out there, with many of the media titles owned by billionaires who can see taxes for the wealthy coming. And let's face it, one of the solutions to climate change is taxing the wealthy and limiting their lifestyles. And Tim talks about neoliberalism and personal freedom. That's just not consistent with tackling climate change. The wealthiest are in the UK, the wealthiest 1%, their emissions are 11 times the emissions of someone in the poorest 50%. And then if you look at the poorest 50% in the world, their emissions are negligible and their birth rates aren't really doing anything. People often talk about population. The issue is with the wealthiest, and that's got to be tackled, and that's why the government's dragging its heels. But the beauty of the CEE bill is that we don't have to get into all the details about exactly what we have to do. We just have to make an agreement with each other that we must take action. We must lock our policy into what the science says, and who can object to that? There's going to be a lot of money that has to be spent, but we've faced big challenges before, in the run up to World War II. Can you imagine if people were saying, oh, it's going to cost too much and it's going to be a bit disruptive? Well, no, we just got on with it because it was the risk was a little bit more immediate. It felt more immediate. This is a bit of more of a slow burn risk, but believe you me, it won't be long before we start seeing some more catastrophic events, and perhaps next time it will be in the UK. But we need to get on with it now, and that's why I'm really urging everyone to write to their MP, talk to everyone else about it that they know, and I think the CE bill is the best hope. Sorry if I didn't answer your question there, Jim.
Well, you answered a better question. Thank you. Tim, I'd like to turn to you on that one, really, because you'd said recently, I think it was on Twitter, if we carry on the way we're going now, I can't see this civilization lasting to the end of this century. No chance, in my view, on the current trajectory, which is a pretty depressing thing to read. And in the news today, there was more revelations about actually, once you add up all the pledges that are going on up there in Glasgow at the moment, I think that would add up to sort of 2.4 degrees or something like that. So way above the 1.5 degrees, and even the 1.5 degrees figure is a percentage chance that we have to remain in control of our climate. So I just wondered, Tim, do you think the reason why people are so reticent about making big changes, this is something that came up in the chat, is because they don't realise how bad things actually are or could be? Do you think there's an information problem here?
Partly, Jim, because our media have largely let us down for a few decades for some of us on this issue. I was a 18-year-old student in the early 1990s protesting about the threat from global warming. the WTO, the loss of the Amazon rainforest, the ozone hole at the time. But it's only very recently that that the BBC even has really stopped trying to always trawl out a climate skeptic to offer a counter view to a climate science on this issue. And where was Sir David Attenborough when we needed him? You know, it's all very well. I mean, I salute him coming to the cause now, but frankly, he's had a long time. He could have got behind this before now. So it's wrong to call out a national icon, I'm sure, but we can all agree we've lost a lot of time, and we're still basically stuck in a culture which just it's grown up for 300 years thinking about the world as a gigantic clockwork machine, which it isn't, and it's having real difficulty kind of even just beginning to comprehend this climate crisis and this ecological crisis that's kind of kicking off around us, because that doesn't look like the workings of this sort of machine where you do a certain change and you get a proportional response. It is already behaving with these kind of tipping dynamics. We've got a bit of a journey to go on there, right? Because and we have to look to change. Yeah, we've still got work to do to change the wide scale media and the public discourse, and just educate each other about the way the complex system of the climate ecosystems, Gaia, whatever you want to call it, actually works. Then we might start to get our brain keyed into, you know, how complex systems behave. That is on the one hand scary, and that's sort of what keeps me awake at night. But on the other hand, it's empowering if you realize that you can use the same thinking to think about how we get ourselves out of the massive hole we've dug. Because it's only if you really embrace this kind of living systems view of change that you can see that there are ways for change to accelerate radically. And you look back into history, and not too far into history, to see that there can be these profound tipping points in public opinion, but in actual action on substantive issues. I often think of my sort of great aunt Lillian, who was Lenton, one of the suffragettes. In my darker moments, I kind of think back to her going on hunger strike in prison, and they put the tube down her throat the wrong way into her lungs, flooded her lungs with food, nearly killed her. The government covered it up at the time. It became obvious that she wasn't ill because she was on hunger strike. It was what was done to her in prison, and that was part of what turned the then citizenship against the government on votes for women in the UK. And that changed. Okay, it took time, but we can all think of iconic examples where the society has really changed quite profoundly, and democracy has changed quite profoundly. So I might have drifted off the question a bit there, Jim, but I'm just trying to convey some of the flavour of this digs really deep. This digs into worldviews and how we understand the world, and that's our template for thinking about not only, oh dear, what a crisis we're in, but also the right ways to try and think our way and act our way out of it, basically.
Thank you, Tim. You answered that incredibly articulately and with great depth, as everybody has done this evening. So thank you. Bridget, I would like to ask you, I mean, do you feel like you are listened to as an expert in your field, either by the media or government? I mean, you're dealing with critical issues in actually transforming our world. What are the challenges to you in your department in terms of getting those messages out, either via the media or to the people who hold the purse strings and actually need to fund this?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not used to being listened to as an academic, I have to say. It's like, it's generically difficult to get your message out, I think, because on the one hand, we're required to produce all this really detailed research and very dry papers that no one in their right mind will ever look at. And on the other hand, be able to express that in an engaging and articulate way to make it, to turn it into sound bites. And that can be a really complicated thing, particularly as Tim was talking about, when you're talking about large complex systems. I can bang on for hours about what an electricity system is and how it operates and where you need to intervene. But it's incredibly difficult to turn that into a sexy soundbite. But yeah, I mean, if you find the right audience and the right ways of the right people to talk to, then the media does get it. So if you there are some journalists who are particularly well informed and particularly engaged on electricity systems or on heat or whatever it might be, and you can have a really detailed and productive conversation with them, and you may not see a sexy little soundbite coming in an article they write, but you can see the influence of your conversations on what it is and how they approach stories and things. I think politicians are harder to crack, actually. Politicians are as the example of your local MP shows, actually. They are sympathetic. They sometimes understand some of the complexity, but is that what's going to win them the next vote, or is that what is going to get them up the ministerial greasy pole? So they're inherently much more short term in a way, and they will listen, but that doesn't listening doesn't mean they'll act, and quite a lot of the time, unless it's a real passion of theirs, they won't.
Thank you very much for that. That resonates around the passion, and certainly I think in these forums before we've had discussions around certain things being acted on, but then a huge sort of perceived selective blindness onto other things that aren't necessarily within that sphere of interest. Alastair, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, but it's just, well, I suppose it's reflecting on both of those points, I suppose, a little bit. Is this, nobody likes the really horribleness that the climate emergency is, so nobody really wants to read it. The reality ain't great. I can't. So that's where, of course, we need governments to be the adults in the room and make the decisions to force us through. However, Tim and Bridget are right. Hopefully the governments will listen to the people. So if we can get the people shouting, then we'll get the governments we want. But it feels like we're quite a way away from that yet. There was that survey that came out earlier this week that is generally showing that everybody wants to do something about climate emergency, but when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, like, well, I'm not doing that. So it's a bit crazy, really.
Yeah. Thank you, Alastair. You wanted to say something, Bridget?
Just to illustrate that point, actually. Going back, I mentioned the heat and building strategy came out, and the net zero strategy came out a couple of weeks ago, and at the same time, the government put out thousands of pages of supporting information and other reports and things like that. And there was one from the Behavioural Insights Unit, also known as the Nudge Unit, which was published and was looking at what sort of behaviour changes might we be able to tweak out of people. Things like, attacks on flights, or sort of changing how might we be able to actually change people's behaviour. And so that was out for a couple of days, and then it disappeared. And the government removed it from the website and sort of unpublished it. And the point is that they don't want, it's not just that people don't want to change. It's like they're not being told they need to change, or the sorts of changes that people can make aren't being made clear to them by the government. And actually, the government sort of rather falsely trying to say that everything's going to continue as normal, and everything's going to be lovely, and no one's going to notice anything. Whereas in fact, actually, stuff does have to change, and we need to start being honest about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. There's a lot of agreement in the chat going on to that point. And I just wanted to throw to you, Tim, to, obviously you were up there in Glasgow, and it was only a couple of days ago, there was a newspaper, in all the newspapers, around the size of the delegations, and that the fossil fuel lobby had more people at COP than even the countries who are most affected or going to be most affected by climate change. Is there a problem around undue lobbying influence on the direction in which we're heading?
Almost certainly, folks, one would infer from all the evidence. But we're in a big political battle now, as we're all acknowledging. So we've got, you know, if we crudely divide societies up into some super rich, sometimes super rich vested interests in the current status quo, like those fossil fuel lobbies. And then we've got people perhaps poorer than some of us on the panel who might be worried that they're going to be disadvantaged by the transformation. And then there's those of us who might loosely identify ourselves in the middle somewhere. Now, we are in this transformation, we've got to be absolutely sure that the poorer people are protected and do not lose out. That's what we mean by just transformation. That takes art in politics. That's going to take a lot of good, hard political work. And we're all going to worry a bit about the capability of our elected officials to do that work. But in Germany, they've shown that with what's called the Coal Commission, that they could go to the coal producing region of Germany and show the people there that there was an alternative life for them and it might be a better and happier life. It wasn't an easy process, but coming back to the big picture, for sure, we've got to ensure no one put worse off than ourselves is left behind. But as for the very rich vested interests trying to maintain the current status quo, we have no obligation morally at all to look after their interests. They look after them. They are doing a very good job of looking after their own interests. So what we really need in the middle ground is a spectacular coalition of action from the middle ground that is going to win this battle with some of those vested interests that are still indeed very strong and very present. But I do see some signs of hope. I mean, I happily participated in a 2-day fringe festival at the COP with Federated Hermes, responsible investment manager, and I listened to members of the financial sector go up on stage and call out Shell for its joke of a scenario. It calls it the sky scenario, that it thinks we can do exactly what Simon showed us earlier, which is have a massive party and burn all of those oil reserves that we've found already. And then we're going to bank on having this unbelievable capability to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in a couple of generations' time, which is totally nuts. And it wasn't me calling that out. This is like people in the finance sector who are getting this stuff. So I've got a little bit of hope there that we're starting to really open the public discussion as we need to on this and be honest and level with each other on it. But yeah, for sure, you know, if President Biden can't get his kind of Green New Deal through Congress because one Democratic representative for a state with a strong coal industry history, then that's almost like an acid test, because if the politicians are good enough, they should be able to win that one vote round for the good of us all. So yes, I might have drifted a little from the rich vested interests to protecting the poorer who need a just transformation. But my point is, some of us have got to be taking that whole system's view of how the practical politics of how you're going to make this transformation happen. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. So Phil, we're approaching the end, and I just wanted to pick up on that point around legislation. You had talked about sort of a lack of sort of toothy legislation around new builds. Do you think that we do need this tough legislation generally on business to be more transparent and open on their policies on climate and nature in your role as a strategic planner?
Oh, very much so. Yeah. Well, it's hard to know where to begin really with the development sector. Although I think it's probably symptomatic of a number of other sectors, the fossil fuel industry as well. Transparency and openness clearly aren't part of the playbook, really, are they? It's around the narrative for them is more around. It's shifted from denial to delay. And it's very much kind of they are going to dictate to us the timescales that they're willing to change at, and not the other way around. And I think that's clearly not where we need to kind of shape that discussion. I kind of echo everything that everybody else has said around the need to have a kind of grown-up political discourse around this. Unfortunately, every day I open a newspaper, which obviously I don't do, but or read something online, it just seems to get further and further away from the position that we need to be in terms of informing discussion and debate around these issues, because there's so much short-term self-interest. That seems to be the cornerstone of governance these days in the kind of countries that we live in, where the economies are so reliant on the vested interests that the rest of us don't seem to get a look in, or aren't able to influence change in the way that we feel we should be able to, not through the elected representative model that we've got now. And obviously the example that Simon gives us around how he's engaged with anti-Magnan and the C bill is a case in point, really. And I think Bridget mentioned something about the kind of wider citizens assembly model being much more robust and much more fit for purpose in terms of what we need now in terms of drastic short-term reduction in emissions. But I think we're probably some way away from that kind of political revolution. I might be wrong, actually. Who knows? Who knows what's around the corner? But yeah, a citizens' assembly or something where there's just much more direct accountability for the decisions that we're taking. That would just seem like a much more. I don't know. I'd have a lot more faith in us as a species, if we were able to kind of deliver something like that in the short term than where we're at now.
Thank you, Phil. It's interesting to hear the Citizens' Assembly coming up again as a really valid strategy here. So we're going to start to wrap up now. At the very end, I'm going to share a poll with our audience, and that people can complete that. Just before I do, could I just ask, and we'll just go around each of the panel, what would you like and hope to see happening in policy in the immediate term? What would be the sort of the biggest immediate thing that would really improve your particular area of interest? So it might be climate, it might be citizens' assemblies, for example. Could I start with you, please, Alastair?
Oh, it's not the alphabetical order there. Damn.
Yeah.
Well, there's lots. I suppose. I'm a keen, passionate believer in retrofit. So I would really, what would be good in there? I suppose something around, also would annoy landlords, but the rental sector, that you're not allowed to rent out a property with an EPC of a, well, say C, but I'd like to go higher than that. Something along those lines would be good.
Great answer. Okay, Phil.
The permitted development rights, it's the bane of my life. It's not good planning. Like, it's completely divorced from good spatial planning. Why not bring about something like permitted development for community-led energy renewable schemes, something like that, something that where there's actual tangible benefit, rather than permitted development rights to turn barns into houses in the middle of nowhere.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Simon.
Well, you know what I'm going to say. We've heard about the difficulty of getting all these policies that we know we've got to implement past the public who are just not ready. But so the obvious way for me is to just put everything behind pushing for the CEE bill and get that legally binding commitment. Everything will flow from that. And I do think we're nearing a sort of tipping point in terms of persuading MPs to back it. We're seeing more and more come on board. And just picking up briefly on something Tim mentioned about protecting, the interests of the poorer sector of society, people who are going to be impacted by change, who may have to move out of the fossil fuel sector or whatever. This one of the few provisions in the CE bill, which does stay very broad, it's just a framework, is a provision to ensure that communities are not impacted, and particularly young people, to avoid the problems that we had with when the mining industry was closed down. So that's being catered for. And I just wanted to briefly mention something Bridget mentioned about the heat strategy. yes, they're making good progress on new build, but the retrofit market is the biggest part of it, and it's woefully inadequate. The amount of money committed to the heat pump grant, which allows for about 30,000 houses to be retrofitted a year, would mean that we would take almost 1,000 years to retrofit our housing stock. And we can't expect people to pay for it themselves. Very few people can afford to put heat pumps in. This is an issue of national security. Governments have no trouble pulling together the funding to go to war. We don't sit there going, oh, it's a bit expensive. They just spend it. We spent it on COVID. We spent it on tackling the global financial crisis. And we need to now spend it on decarbonising our housing and all the other things, because there are no prizes for trying or doing a little bit of it. We've got to do all of it. And the only way to get there is the CE bill. So please email your MP. Thank you.
Didn't quite get your message there, Simon. Bridget, what would be the big thing for you?
Stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Yeah, it's massive, and yeah, why? How do you square that with trying to decarbonize things? And coupled with that, obviously, stop new investments in coal mines in Cumbria or digging up the North Sea for further reserves.
Thank you, very direct. And Tim.
I had the same answer as Bridget. I'm glad you got there first. We're not quite sure how many billions of pounds this totals per annum, because there's many elements to it, but it's quite a lot of billions, and it's about how then we would redirect that public money into the Green New Deal, if you want to call it that. So I think quite a bit of it can happily go to the social safety nets to make it a more just transformation. But yeah, for what's left over once you've put the social safety net for those who might be less well off and might lose out, then let's pour it into all the things we've been discussing about building the new infrastructure we need. And I would also extend the point, I think, and say stop subsidizing forms of land use and farming that are bad for health, bad for the planet, and just would cease to exist were it not for the subsidies. Now, clearly, again, those farmers who will be put out of business need to be part of that social safety net. And frankly, they can be incentivized to do much more pro-ecology, pro-climate things on their land. And maybe they'll discover that that's also quite a nice way of life. Let's hope so. But yeah, that would just be to extend the point really to some of the other subsidizing we're doing of greenhouse gas emissions through crazy forms of farming and land use.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to launch the poll now for everybody to complete. Please complete, because we're going to do this in a very time limited way so that everybody does complete. I'm going to read it for the panel. Policy for the climate and nature emergency. So the question is, in terms of policy for the climate and nature emergency, and then the options are: we should allow business to drive and assess their own policies on climate and nature. The other response is: we need tougher legislation on business to be transparent and open in their policies on climate and nature. The third response is: the crisis is too urgent to allow government and big business to rely on transparency and self-assessment. I'll campaign for increased legislation. And then the fourth response is: we need a citizens' assembly to ensure concerns and accountability is raised clearly with policymakers, and I will campaign for this. So just waiting for everybody to complete that poll. Just a few more seconds, if everybody can make sure they do complete that. Almost there. 76% of people have responded so far, just waiting for the remaining. Whilst that's just completing, I'll just explain what's going to happen after that. We will share the results, and then we will say bye-bye. We have got another discussion coming up this Friday, the 12th at 7 o'clock on sustainability and fishing. And on the panel will be Anthony Mangnall MP, as well as a wide range of representatives across the fishing industry and also sort of marine and scientific groups. So thank you, Massimo, you're sharing the flyer there. So Massimo, can we share the results? That's brilliant. Okay, so in terms of responses, 4% said that we should allow business to drive and assess their own policies on climate and nature. 63% responded, we need tougher legislation on business to be transparent and open in their policies on climate and nature. Okay, people could respond to more than one of these. 67% responded, the crisis is too urgent to allow government and big business to rely on transparency. I'll campaign for increased legislation. And 70% of people said, we need a citizens' assembly to ensure concerns and accountability is raised clearly with policymakers, and I'll be campaigning for it. Okay. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for participating tonight, panel. If I can ask the panel to remain. And what we'll do is in a second, we will play our sort of farewell sequence. I hope to see everybody this Friday. It's going to be a very exciting and hugely relevant debate in terms of the locality, obviously within our area. You know, the fishing industry plays a big role historically in our area. So it's an important debate and we need sort of real clear and accurate informed discussion around that. So we're going to share you our farewell video, and if I can ask everybody else to please leave and the panel to remain. Thank you.